And we are back with the second episode of the top 90 albums of the 90s, counting down in this episode numbers 80 to 71 with my good friend here, Nathaniel Ahart. And yeah, you guys voted for these, so can't wait to see what's next. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be some really interesting picks on this episode for sure, and definitely some interesting points of conversation. This
Oh,
must be noted
no
ahead of.
doubt, man. I can't wait to get into it. So let's not waste any time. Let's get right to it at number 80.
This is Halloween, this is Halloween, pumpkins scream in the dead.
The Nightmare Before Christmas original soundtrack by the one and only Danny Elfman. He makes the list once again. He made the 80s with Batman, and here we are again. And I think I know who might have helped get this on the list. So thank you. And yeah, I mean, this is definitely one of the most iconic animated films ever made. And I mean, across seasonal film in the tradition of Halloween and Christmas. And I think not only that's the reason it makes it really special, but just the stop motion animation. I mean, this is the greatest stop motion animated film ever made, at least that I've seen. I think most people can agree with that. It's only 76 minutes long, and every single detail they put into the frame of this movie is just absolutely astounding. And I think probably Danny Elfman's best soundtrack, just from top to bottom. I mean, the shimmering bells, the plucky strings, the lush orchestration, the beautiful horns, brass, woodwinds, accordions, I mean, organs, pianos, everything you can think of is on this album, but yet it feels like a very, very unified sound throughout the entire thing. Now, this album is not without its issues, and I will get into that. But come on, just look at the best songs. Like, this is Halloween. Everybody knows it's one of the first numbers that opens up the movie, and I think perfectly sets, this idea of Halloween Town and everything about it. Well, I don't know if Halloween Town, but anyway, you get what I'm talking about. And yeah, and of course, beautiful, beautiful songs like Jack's Lament, because obviously Danny Elfman, Chris Sarandon did the voice work of the character of Jack Skellington. Danny Elfman he gave him some demos for these songs, right? And he was singing on it, and they're like, should we get another singer? It's like, no, Elfman is just, his voice fits these songs perfectly. And I don't think that Tim Burton and crew could have picked a better person than Elfman to sing these songs on, like, Jack's Lament, or What's This, which is my personal favorite, when he goes to Christmas Town for the first time and he's just taking in everything that's around it. One of the most beautiful scenes in the film, one of the most vibrant, and musically one of the most interesting songs on the whole album. But I think that the thing that makes this album so special too is just how I think this just shows you how much of a genius Danny Elfman is, the way he's able to shift between these styles. Like Oogie Boogie song, it's not my favorite. I don't even quite love it, but it's basically a New Orleans jazz number, which I thought was really, really cool. And then To the Rescue, which comes in, just the orchestration near the end of the movie, it seamlessly shifts from a straight up jazz number to like this gothic horror piece with like these organs coming in the mere matter of seconds. It's just like a drop of a hat for Elfman, and it feels just so melodic still and just so explorative. I will say I think the structure of this album is a bit strange, and of course a lot of the songs are very theatrical because it's an animated movie, and that doesn't always translate over when you're listening, because it sounds like a little grating. But I still think the songs are so great, and the lyricism is so clever, especially on songs like Making Christmas, which is absolutely hysterical in the most twisted way possible. Like, these lyrics are like absolutely geniusly clever. When you're watching the movie, it's just laugh out loud from one song to another. But I also just think that Patrick Stewart comes in and narrates, which doesn't even make sense because not even the movie. And then the closing, monologue he gives, he's like talking about Jack having Skellington babies. I'm like, what the hell is this? This is stupid. And I just don't think the closing or the end credits are as good as the rest of the stuff on this album. So I think those things are holding this back for me from being like a 9 out of 10, because this was in my top 10 of the 90s. I absolutely love this movie, and I think the soundtrack is really probably undoubtedly Danny Elfman's best work.
Well, I disagree with you there. I think it's not better than Batman, in my opinion. The
Okay.
melodies do not come close.
Okay, fair
Maybe it
enough.
would help if I saw the movie.
Yeah.
But, listening to the soundtrack, which I did a couple weeks ago, I was not that impressed, man, honestly. Like,
What?
yeah, I couldn't really get into it. Like, What's This is the only one that really I felt was kind of interesting in a storytelling and melodic way. But like,
Hmm.
This Is Halloween, This Is Halloween, I was like, all right, this is
How
annoying.
did oh you Grinch. You Grinch. Come on. Come on.
Second Christmas album on the top 90s. Yeah, ridiculous. I am a Grinch.
This is the best
So
one. You're crazy, man. You're
well,
crazy.
well, yeah, man, I didn't vote for it, so that's all I gotta say.
Fair compromise.
Yeah, I
It's
guess.
great, guys. I mean, if you guys know the movie, you know how it is. So that's all I'll say on that.
All right. I didn't hate it, so
Okay, that's fair.
I just don't think it deserves to be on the list.
I
But
think it does.
all right.
Absolutely. Watch the movie, you know? It's
Yeah,
the
I
time of
guess so.
year. It's the time of year you can watch it from Halloween all the way to Christmas. So
Good
this
point.
holiday season, my friend.
I'll check it out and maybe I'll
Okay.
like it more. All right.
I think you will.
Fair enough. All right. Now at number 79. Core by Stone Temple Pilots, their debut album from 1992. The guys from California coming on the map in a big way. Of course, this coming right on the heels of bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam in the grunge period. So they were compared a lot to those bands early on, but they really paved their own way, I thought. And right from the get-go, especially the combo of the brothers Dean DeLeo and Robert DeLeo on bass, they really do some interesting chord changes, especially on their big hit Plush, which is a huge standout on this album. Amazing song. And of course, Scott Weiland's vocals are top notch throughout. But he really shines there. The opening track, Dead and Bloated, is really cool. I love the different parts to that song. It's definitely they're a hard rocking band, but they also can really excel in the acoustic format as well, like on Creep, which is possibly one of my favorites on the album. That was a huge hit as well. One of just several songs named Creep that we'll be talking about on this countdown, probably. Not maybe not Radioheads, but we'll talk about that. But also Sex Type Thing, I think, is an amazing hard rock song. The second track, so propulsive. Really, I mean, just right out of the gate, this band was like fully formed and knew what they were doing, and doing it, firing on all cylinders. So I'm so glad this made the list.
Mhm. Well, I wouldn't have it above Nightmare Before Christmas for my personal taste, but I will say I
Whatever.
didn't get to this album before this list came out, and I'm kind of upset that I didn't, because the really interesting thing about Stone Temple Pilots is they sound like a cross between Nirvana and Pearl Jam, so that automatically makes them better than Pearl Jam if you even out the scales in my book. But that's the thing, like they obviously owe a lot to those who came before them, but I think to me the reason why this stands out was, one, I was listening to these songs, I'm like, I've definitely heard these hooks before, but I think they took what Pearl Jam did and I think made more refined melodies out of what they were doing. And I think Scott Weiland's voice was just, I think yet again, he sounds like a cross between Cornell and Vedder in that way. And I think his voice is really effective and definitely the one they needed to tell these songs. And like you mentioned, I like Dead and Bloated a lot. I don't think the lyrics really mean anything. So it's like
No.
not my favorite, but it's a cool song. It's definitely catchy and hooky, but Sex Type Thing is such a great rock song, and obviously just talking about like kind of the anti-rape message, which bands like Nirvana would get into, I think literally like a year later, so that predates it by a little bit. Wicked Garden is another one that's just absolutely phenomenal, one of my absolute
Yeah.
favorites on the album, just talking about that loss of innocence and losing it to, you know, kind of the temptations of the world. Brilliant, brilliant stuff. I also really love Naked Sunday, really very propulsive song on there. As you said, Creep is beautiful. Maybe goes on a bit too long, but I mean, it's such a beautiful song. You gotta love it. And Plush was obviously the big hit off of this that everyone remembers. But I also love Piece of Pie too. You know, that one is really underrated, I think. And just I really think Stone Temple Pilots. I wish I checked them out earlier because they really have that definitive grunge sound that I think was so indicative of this decade, and why I think they made the list at this spot. And I'm certainly not upset that they came in right around here, but maybe
Yeah.
even could have been higher. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think they could have been a little bit higher, honestly, but I'm really glad that you enjoyed them, and I think
Mhm.
you'll like Purple as well, the next album, and really they didn't quite go. I wouldn't say downhill necessarily, but I think their first couple albums were really their best. So we'll see as the list goes on if we see some more STP, but. For now, here is number 78.
Crazy Sexy Cool by TLC, baby. Yeah, from 1994. This album is really an R&B classic for sure from the 90s. When you think of the definitive girl groups from the 90s, you think of, you know, something like the Spice Girls or Destiny's Child, but I think really the one that found the most success and critically and commercially, just in general, if you combine the two together, I think it's definitely TLC. And man, I mean, this is definitely an iconic album from the 90s. It was on my list, and just that beautiful fusion between hip hop and R&B, especially with, you know, Lisa Left Eye Lopes, who's not really featured on a lot of the songs, but you know, when it comes down to it, I think certainly you know, bring some standout moments on here. But I mean, just starting off with like songs like Creep and Kick Your Game and Digging on You. I mean, really, what a great way to kick off the album, really. I mean, these are absolute classics of the 90s, and just talking about like, you know, very, very feminized songs about the party scene, and just, you know, talking about men in a certain way that was very empowering to women at the time. And I think that's why maybe this album gets a lot of credit that it absolutely deserves. And I mean, there's so many great tracks on here, but I think obviously, I think the closing track, Something Wicked This Way Comes, featuring Andre 3000, and kind of him telling his story about how he kind of fell into hard times as a kid and then realized that I have to change the trajectory of my life. And well, we all see how he turned out. So that's good. And I just think a brilliant song from a storytelling perspective. But man, Waterfalls is just one of the absolute best songs from the 90s. And I just think, yet again, the storytelling on here, whether it be about this gangster who just can't escape this volatile life of his until, you know, as they say, another body lying dead in the gutter. I mean, it's such a gut punch. And just yet again, as I say about the storytelling, it's so layered, it's so subtle, especially when in the second verse where they're talking about the guy who's dying of HIV. They like that brilliant line in 3 letters took him to his final resting place. They don't have to say what it is, but you know exactly what it is. And just the message, you know, in that beautiful hook, that don't go chasing waterfalls, please stick to the rivers and the lakes that you used to, you know. And just the way it was saying, you know, just take life easy, and don't try to get over ambitious. Just try to do what you know. Don't get ahead of yourself, and try to stay sane. I said, but it's just really just the idea of chasing unobtainable goals is something we should all kind of keep in mind. Not saying we should limit ourselves, but it really is one of the most thought-provoking, one of the most melodic, one of the most iconic and important songs from the 90s. And when Lisa Left Eye Lopes comes in rapping on that thing, it's certainly one of the most memorable moments on the album. I think the thing that holds this album back is probably the lack of great songs on the second half, though I said the closing track's pretty great. And just interludes like Sexy, where it comes to a point where you're just shitting on the toilet. It's actually disgusting. I don't want to hear that. In their very misguided cover of If I Was Your Girlfriend, because as we talked about in the 80s series, that's a very psychosexual song. And I don't think it makes sense coming from a woman, because Prince was very, very specific with what he was doing with that track. And I just don't think it translates over at all. And it's basically a very, very faithful rendition without the Camille vocals, and I just don't think it's as good. But regardless, this album was fairly high, is probably near the upper half of the lower half of my list. That makes sense. I don't know, but it was on the list, and I think absolutely deserving of a spot here.
Yeah, I think it's deserving of a spot. It's definitely, as you said, one of the premier R&B albums of that decade. And yeah, just for Waterfalls and Creep, which there's the other Creep I was just talking about with Stone Temple Pilots, back to back of all things.
What do you know?
Yeah, those were two songs you couldn't escape. So yeah, and Waterfalls, I mean, you said it all about it. That's a great track, universal and timeless, and love the bass line in it too. It was so great. And yeah, exactly, because it's kind of like that old school R&B that you gotta love. And yeah, the hip-hop elements work really well with Left Eye when she's part of it. So yeah, glad it made the list, and I think it's at a pretty good spot there.
Yeah, I mean, I could see it a little bit higher, but I'm not upset. It is where it's at. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So great pick, guys. So now that brings us to number 77.
Loveless by My Bloody Valentine from 1991. This really is what most people would consider the definitive shoegaze album. Definitely very much a project of Kevin Shields, which I believe this album took a few years to record, believe it or not. They put a lot of effort into the sound of this album. And I really love a lot of the fuzzed out guitar tones on here, and some really shimmering melodies. Of course, when it comes to like songs like When You Sleep and I Only Said, which is probably the most hypnotic song on this entire album. Absolutely beautiful track. But this is often considered one of the greatest albums of all time, and it did make the Nathaniel Ahart and Company's top 100, and a higher spot than this. So I was kind of surprised to see it this low, but quite frankly, I'm not upset that it's this low, because I think that this is you got to give it credit when it comes to influence, because it basically created an entire genre, for better or for worse, however you look at it. But I don't understand, like, I think this album's quite overrated. I think in some way it deserves to be on the list just because of its influence, but I've never understand like making music in this style. Like, they have lyrics, right? But they're so thrown in the back, and the band doesn't even want you to know what they are. And I'm like, okay, well, what's the point? Like, why couldn't you just made this like an instrumental album? And I probably would have liked it more, but even then, I think it gets very samey by the end of it. And I just don't understand. Like, I get this album's impactful, and a lot of people really resonate with it, but I don't know why, because there's like nothing you can really latch onto, at least from my perspective. I don't really see besides the sonic landscape they're creating, this very hazed out sound that I think the album cover, I got to give it credit, is basically what you're going to listen to. So it really does kind of define it in that way. But to say that this is one of the absolute best albums of the 90s, I think is sort of ludicrous. But I understand why it's on the list, and I can certainly get behind it in that sense. Just I'm glad it's not higher.
Yeah, I can summarize the way I feel about this album in one word: junkyard. This album belongs in a junkyard because it is garbage. It sounds terrible. The production is horrendously awful. I understand what shoegaze music is, and there's some artists that are in that vein that I actually enjoy, but This, man, the guitars are gratingly just terrible. The sound that they have, like unbearably bad to listen to. And then, as you said, can't understand the vocals. What's the point of them? It's just like this is one of the most overrated albums of all time, in my opinion. I don't get it. You see it on a lot of lists very high for the 90s, and I'm glad it
All
is
time.
at least this low, because in my opinion, it doesn't deserve to even be on the list.
Okay, but I think you're discrediting it a little bit though. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I
'Cause,
may
like,
be
you
over the
gotta
top a
give
little
credit
bit.
where credit's due.
Yes,
know?
I mean, like you said, they did invent a
Yeah.
subgenre, as it were, but
I mean,
yeah,
would I have been
that,
upset if it was left off? No, but I think in some way it does deserve to be on the list. It's just not
yeah, I
my
guess.
personal thing.
Yeah,
But I still think
I
it's
may be a
overrated.
little harsh. Maybe I'll lose some
Yeah, I
subscribers
think
over it,
so.
but I don't care. That's my opinion, man. So
Yeah, well.
whatever.
We can meet halfway, I suppose, but
Yeah,
you know,
yeah. So
we
you
can
didn't
both
hate it like I did, but
no,
okay.
not at all. I just don't think it's like it's groundbreaking in some sense, but I just don't think it should be.
Yeah.
But we can't discredit it. We can't completely discredit it, John.
All right. All right.
That's what
Fine.
I'm trying to get at, you know.
All right.
We gotta think about it, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I'm the bad guy on this episode. I'm having fun.
Obviously, yeah.
Yeah. It may not be over yet. So now at number 76.
Love Deluxe by Sade, the fourth studio album from this English. I would say I was going to say rock, but they're definitely more, kind of jazzy R&B oriented. Of course, with Sade Adu, the band's namesake, on lead vocals, and of course putting in a lot of the songwriting with the group. And yeah, I think that this is definitely, well, I wouldn't say definitely, but I think it's their best album. Though I have to say, I know a lot of people say No Ordinary Love is like one of the best songs from the 90s. I think it's very overrated. I think it's very samey, and the fact that it goes on for over 7 minutes, I don't necessarily think helps it. Because this is my problem with this album. I think the first 3 songs or so are like okay and don't stand out to me at all, because they just, fall into that slow jam R&B kind of vein where the lyrics are very repetitive as well as the music. Not to say it isn't beautiful or classy or sophisticated, because it certainly is. But I think once you get to songs like A Tattoo, which is just very, flamenco styled in its nature, and just talking about like PTSD, like once I think Sade really starts delving into those topics, I think the album becomes that much more interesting. Or something like Kiss of Life, or I think more so, songs like Pearls and Bulletproof Soul, or that beautiful instrumental outro, Mermaid. Yeah, Kiss of Life, I think, is another one that's kind of fine. I don't know why I mentioned that. Regardless, I think that those songs are amazing. I think the rest of the album is kind of okay, but really you got to give it to Sade for really kind of pushing that quiet storm R&B genre to a certain playing field that a lot of their contemporaries weren't doing. And I think just for those tracks alone that I mentioned, the musical diversity on here, I think, is even greater than Diamond Life, which I would say almost made the 80s list. But yeah, I had this album on my list. Granted, it was near the bottom, so I think that this is perhaps an appropriate spot for this album, and I'm glad it was above Loveless, to be quite honest with you, because I think even you would agree with me. It is better. Yeah, I mean, it's better
I
than
had to do that
but,
to you, man.
I get it.
You did
In
it
some
on
way.
Sigur Rós. I had to do it on this
Well,
one.
at least this is higher. So,
But no, this album did bore me, man. Like I have to say, even though I'll give you that the music is well crafted, especially the track that you mentioned.
best song
The
on there.
guitar is beautiful. For me though, like if I'm gonna have something that is this chill, I would have rather had like 10 Summoner's Tales by Sting, which somehow did not make the list, but this made it. because that at least like gets your pulse going on a couple songs. This is just like very subdued throughout the album. And I could see, for certain, like, soft dinner gatherings, that kind of vibe, this music works well for that. And the certain kinds of jazz I think are perfect for those sorts of occasions. But if I'm going to be listening to this on my own time, I'll just probably pass out. So
Yeah, I mean, I can meet you halfway again. I think because also, I don't think Sade, like, they're held to such the standard. I think they're kind of overrated, even though I do really like this album to some extent. I don't think that it is like that they're one of the best bands from the 80s or 90s. I just don't, because their songs are too simplistic and too long sometimes. But then, as I
yeah,
said, you get some really brilliant stuff on here. And I think when it comes to, kind of like paving out a certain lane, I think you got to give it to Sade there for really, as I said, pushing that quiet storm genre to different playing field. And I think
yeah,
done better than some of their other contemporaries for sure.
sure, yeah, I totally give him credit for that. And yeah, it's interesting the way this episode is really like all over the place genre
Yeah.
wise.
And
I
everyone's going
mean,
to hate you afterwards. So
yes.
keep that in mind.
Exactly. No, I think from here on out I'm okay.
Okay.
So we'll see.
All
But
right.
so now at number 75, Flaming Pie by Paul McCartney makes the list. I'm glad it's here. And this was a bit of a comeback for Paul, coming off the heels of some albums that were not quite his best, let's just say, in the 80s and early 90s. But this, right after they did the Beatles anthology, Paul, was obviously hanging out with George and Ringo a bit more, and kind of reflecting back on what made some of those Beatles albums so great. And you can tell that he was trying to go a little bit more in that direction. And, for Paul, sometimes that's effortless, like on some of the melodies on here, like the song we were singing, which directly alludes to his time with the Beatles and how magical it was. And I feel like he captures the magic here and there on the album, not necessarily all the way throughout, but songs like Calico Skies are very beautiful acoustic songs. Great Day as well at the end of the album, which is just very simple, harkening back to kind of his first solo album where it was just him and an acoustic, and talking about a very simple thing like I'm gonna have a great day. And then also you got big songs like Beautiful Night, which comes right before Great Day, which has Ringo himself on drums and has a great build up with George Martin lending his hand on the orchestration. So again, a little nod to his days with the Beatles. And of course the title track is a lot of fun, Flaming Pie, which comes from the story of where John Lennon said that he had a dream of a man on a flaming pie coming to them and saying, "You shall be called the Beatles," or something like that. So it's a fun little like piano rocker. And I wouldn't say this is up there with like Band on the Run or even his first solo album, but definitely I think it's one of his better albums that came after the 70s era. So it's good to see him on the list.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised at this because I didn't think that any, albums related, from any Beatles members would make the 90s list, but here we
Yeah.
are. We have one in every deck. I mean, the 60s had the Beatles, the
Mhm.
70s had the Beatles and John Lennon and Paul McCartney, a couple times George Harrison, and then the 80s had John Lennon and Yoko Ono, and now here's Paul once again. And yeah,
Yeah.
I think that this, I think it's interesting because obviously the 80s were not a very kind time to Sir Paul McCartney, besides maybe Say, which is just a classic with Michael Jackson. But I think after a long stretch of just absolutely not being able to tap in to the modern landscape of music at the time, or just the melodic sensibilities that Paul is so, I mean, he's the greatest pop songwriter of all time. And I just think that here he definitely comes back to that. It's not beat for beat perfect or as memorable. I think some of the songs on here are good or okay, but I think the best moments, like Some Days, harkening back to that beautiful orchestration that was found on Sergeant Pepper's, what I can only assume is talking about Linda's illness at the time, which would unfortunately take her life just about a year later. Just absolutely beautifully heartbreaking song. Or of course, Calico Skies, which I think by far is the standout on here, just lyrically and musically. He just dials it back and brings the acoustic in and just creates one of his finest melodies that he's crafted in years. And that's the thing, you can tell this whole album is perfectly is much more craft heavy in the sense where it's not perfectly seamless, but it's certainly felt that a lot of effort was put into these songs. And I think really what the best songs on here are the quieter modes, like Little Willow, which I think is just so beautiful, or something like Beautiful Night, as you mentioned, which is just so euphoric and rising to come in right before the end of the album, before Great Day, which I think is a little too simplistic. I think we were kind of talking about that earlier, but I think really you see how strong of a songwriter that Paul is when he taps into sentimentality, like Here, There, Everywhere, for example. I think that's really where Paul shines, and I think that this is an example of this. I don't know, it might have made my 90s list. I have to listen to it one more time, but it's certainly, I think, his best album probably since the 70s. Yeah, I mean, it's not hard to see why I made the list. It's not my favorite Paul McCartney album of all time or anything, but especially having the help of someone like Jeff Lynne or Steve Miller coming in on a couple tracks, even featuring on here, Used to Be Bad, which is a cool blues rocker, not my favorite, and even a number credited to Ringo where he doesn't even sing on it. So that's interesting that was the case. But yeah, it's definitely a comeback album for Paul, and I'm sure that there were even more great things to come after this point.
Yeah, and so glad that he made it. So great pick, guys. So now that brings us to number 74. Ritual de lo Habitual by Jane's Addiction from 1990. This was on a lot of people's lists, actually, and wasn't on mine, unfortunately, because I had not heard it yet. Don't know that I would have added it after the fact, but I just listened to it in the last few weeks, and I got to say I was really impressed by it, especially, with it preceding really the grunge movement. And you can kind of hear a little bit of that style, obviously some punk rock style here, as well as just like a very, I don't know, like a Los Angeles kind of attitude throughout the album. And no one quite sounds like Perry Farrell vocally. He's got something unusual going on. And normally this kind of voice could get a little like jarring or irritating after a while, but I really found him engaging throughout the album. Of course, the big highlight here was Been Caught Stealing, which was a huge music video at the time. I remember being a lot of fun. Almost reminded me of that scene from Raising Arizona with him stealing the Huggies and stuff. But the rest of the album, there's some really great moments. The next song, 3 Days, which is 10 plus minutes, has some really amazing guitar work by Dave Navarro. The song changes up a few times and kind of keeps you on edge, not knowing exactly where it's going to go in a good way. There's some other songs that are also 7+ minutes that don't quite do as well towards the end of the album, but overall there's not really a weak track here, and I gotta say I can't fault it for being on the list. It's a pretty good pick.
Well, Unfortunately, I haven't listened to any of Jane's Addiction yet. I know a little bit of Dave Navarro because obviously he infamously placed John Frusciante after he left the Chili Peppers. So and I think he was quite good. But yeah, this is just one of those things. I haven't listened to the first album, which I also hear is pretty great. Unfortunately, didn't make the list. But I think that this is probably a very solid album. I can't wait to get to them at some point, as always, as I say. So yeah,
All
don't have
right.
much more to say about it.
I hear you, man. Well, that's cool. Well, yeah, the only other thing I could say that maybe on the negative side is I feel like the production could have been a bit better, but this was 1990, and in general, I think things were not being produced greatly at that time. So,
Yeah.
especially in rock. But for what it is, it's great. And yeah, great pick. So now at number 73, Throwing Copper by Live from 1994, their sophomore album, and I believe, their biggest still at this point. I mean, just Lightning Crashes alone, which definitely is one of the standout tracks. Just, beautiful, simplistic 3-chord song that just builds and builds, and Ed Kowalczyk's vocals just unreal throughout this album. I think Live is one of those bands that for some reason, like, I don't know if they're considered underrated or just not talked about as much anymore, but in the mid 90s, man, they were huge. And like Stone Temple Pilots, also in this episode, they kind of were coming after Nirvana, Pearl Jam, so got compared to grunge bands a lot. But you can also hear elements of like REM and U2 and their sound on songs like Selling the Drama. Of course, when they have more bite on songs like I Alone, it feels a bit more grungy. But there's a lot to love here, and there's also some real gems toward the end of the album, like TBD, which has this just very pulsing bass line. And man, when they build into something, it like explodes out of nowhere at the end of that song. It's really incredible. White Discussion is also a great closer that I feel like would kind of show where they were going after this, which to me personally, I think Secret Samadhi was a better album that came out after this. And I would have loved to see that make the list. Sadly, it did not, but I see why Throwing Copper is usually the favorite, because just so many catchy hits that were on this album. All Over You was another one, and even some other B-sides like Waitress. You can see why people love these songs. So glad it made the list.
Yeah, this is another one, like I was saying with Jane's Addiction, I haven't gotten into yet, but I know you're quite fond of them. And yeah, it's just one of those things, or a few albums before. So I was like, well, I'm very busy, so I can't get to this right now. But it seems like a lot of you like it enough that it made it to this point at the list. And yeah, I'm excited to check it out at some point down the line.
I think you dig it, and
Mhm.
I'm sure there's probably multiple songs on here that when you hear it, you'll be like, oh, I know that one, like Lightning
Oh, really?
Crashes, of course. Yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, I think at this point it's even used in movie trailers and stuff at times. So yeah, fantastic album, definitely deserves to be here, and great pick, guys. So now at number 72.
The Immaculate Collection by Madonna from 1990. Of course, one of the most heralded greatest hits compilations of all time. And I think maybe you can agree with me on this. Blows all her 80s albums out of the water. Probably because you're taking almost all the best cherry picked songs off of those albums, like Holiday, like Borderline, like a Virgin, Material Girl, even singles that weren't on album, like Into the Groove. I mean, that's one of her best songs. Of course, like the obvious stuff too, like a Prayer, gotta have that on there. La Isla Bonita off of True Blue, which is absolutely one of her best. Of course, that Latin flavor that she defines so well. And of course, you know, songs like Express Yourself and Cherish, but obviously adding some more singles from the 90s, of course, is came off of the Dick Tracy soundtrack, like Vogue, which is, you know, considered one of her best as well. And then Justify My Love, which was co-written with her by Lenny Kravitz, of all people. And I think one of her most sexual, one of her most erotic songs. And this was right before Erotica hit. So really, that was kind of like signaling where she was going to go with that album and the Sex Book, which kind of broke the whole world open. So really, this is one of my favorite compilation albums of all time, by everything I said. But my few problems with it lie within the fact that there's some songs on here, like I've never understood why I'd say probably Live to Tell is considered one of her best. I think the song's kind of boring.
Mhm.
And I never understood lyrically why people say it's her best, unlike something like a prayer, or you know, something along those lines. I just don't understand it being on here when you could have put on something like True Blue, which I think is just one of those songs that you immediately hear, you immediately think of Madonna. It gets stuck in your head even if you don't know it is Madonna. And also I think some of the remixes are kind of like a prayer on here isn't the version from the album, which is undeniably like the most iconic and timeless version of that song. It's a bit altered. Same thing with I'd say Express Yourself, which I think the production on Express Yourself might even be better on here. But I think just having the lack of those original mixes, you know, or something like on Holiday, certainly hurt it a little bit, but still, I mean, you know, it's like a prayer. It's one of the greatest songs ever. So I still think that this is like a 9 out of, this was in my top 10 of the 90s. Once again, two of my top 10 albums made this episode, but since it's a greatest hits album and it's not a legend, I'm not upset that it's this low on the list. If anything, I'm glad it made the list, and I think it should absolutely be here.
Yeah, I don't really have a any leg to stand on to criticize having a compilation
Yeah.
album on here, since Legend was so high on my 80s list. But
Number one, yes.
absolutely, yeah, it
Yeah.
was. But here, yeah, I mean, and it's a great compilation. I mean, there's no doubt about it. You got a little bit of everything, and it becomes essential to a degree to have songs like Vogue that were released as singles, or you know, were not on other albums. So yeah, I can't fault it for being here. I just think, you know, we've talked about Madonna a bit recently on the 80s, of course, but hey, she was just as relevant, if not more, in the 90s, and
If not
um,
better.
yeah, in some ways.
Yeah.
So yeah, we may be talking about her again on this list. We'll see. And who knows, maybe into the new millennium. I mean,
Could be.
one thing I can definitely say about Madonna is like she's always been able to change like a chameleon with the times,
Well,
and sometimes be ahead of the game. So
well, and maybe physically is that's a whole other thing I'm
yeah,
not going to get into right now. But
sure,
you
sure.
know, she's definitely, regardless of what you think about Madonna, she's an absolute icon, and I think one of the greatest pop artists of all time. So I'm glad to see that be represented on this album and represented on this list.
Yeah, good pick, guys. So now at number 71, Title by Fiona Apple, the debut album from 1996. And yeah, she made quite a splash just with the single Criminal alone, which, man, I remember the first time I heard that song and I was just like, who is this, with like such a deep and powerful voice, but also like such a sensual, commanding performance on that song in every way. The way that the piano sounds so huge and bassy. I love the production on that song in particular, and I think for many that is the standout here. Throughout the rest of the album, it can be, I don't know, a little softer, a little more melancholy. But you know, there were some other singles here. Sleep to Dream was okay. Shadowboxer, I think, was really strong. But overall, I think this was just showing the potential of what was to come, because for me personally, I think Fiona continued to get better after this. But man, just for Criminal alone, I do think it's deserving to be on the list. So good pick, guys.
I mean, I don't know if I think just because of that song it should be on here, because this is the thing. This is the thing I'll say about Title. I think her lyricism absolutely astounding. Besides Shadow Boxer and Criminal, which is by far the standout and one of her best songs, and also I really love The First Taste.
That's good
I
too,
think
yeah.
that song is absolutely brilliant from an instrumental standpoint. Definitely the most I think more like Eastern flavored from my recollection. Absolutely incredible, and the lyrics on it also match the quality. I just think a lot of the arrangements on here are very samey and very kind of mid. I think that's my biggest problem with this album, but I think obviously her strengths are there. It's just I just don't think I just don't understand why people lose their mind over this record. Like, it's good.
Yeah.
I don't think it should be on the list. Not that I'm upset it made the list. I just, especially over a lot of the albums we talked about today, I don't find it to stand out in any particular way. But it did certainly break her out to a level of success that she would later succeed and expand on musically. But
Yeah, and I
good.
can't remember
Yeah.
how young she was. I know she was still a
It's like
teenager, I want to
19
say,
or
when this
something.
hit.
Yeah.
Yeah, which
It's like
was
around Billie
impressive.
Eilish age when she hit. Yeah.
Right, right. But yeah, I agree with you. I mean, like overall, it's not a great album.
No,
It's
not at all.
definitely hit or miss. And so I could see it, not making the list, but yeah, I'm glad it did. And I think as I said, we may be talking more about her again, hopefully, later on this list. But hey, guys, you've done a great job of voting thus far, even though there's been some that I obviously don't agree with, especially on this episode. But hey, what are you going to do? It's a democracy, right? So
Mhm.
the system is not rigged. I'm telling you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously not. If we're,
Yeah.
sitting up here complaining about Loveless or something making the list.
Yeah.
But it is what it is. So
Exactly, man. So I'm looking forward to the next one. We'll be counting down numbers 70 to 61 on Nathaniel's channel next week. So be sure to like and subscribe to his channel so you can check out much more content as well, and great stuff at that. So thank you guys for being a part of this as always, and we'll see you then.
peace, guys.
See ya.